Hey everybody, this is Sam Coster from Butterscotch Shenanigans, and I want to share another Inkscape time-lapse with everyone from the jam game that I made this weekend with the rest of the studio, which is called Goop Legacy. It is up on itch.io. I'll throw the link in the comments here. And I really want to share this time-lapse video because in the last 6 months or so, I've made a bunch of changes to my overall process that I thought might be of interest to other people who are using Inkscape to make games, or other people who just want to make art for games not using something like Photoshop. So again, this is a vector program, and Inkscape is our weapon of choice when it comes to making games. And what I'm currently trying to do here is just get this basic form of what is essentially going to be one of the 12 species of goos, which are these sort of slime creatures, figured out. And so I've spent a lot more time recently on this initial phase of just kind of trying to get the basic shape and the basic outline of the creature into a really interesting position that has a lot of fun kind of character built into it before I ever start doing kind of the detail work. And so what you'll notice here is sort of a bunch of what I would kind of call fidgeting. So I'm getting these feet in place, doing a lot of wibbling and wobbling to try to put them in the right spot. And I make really heavy use of the node tool. And that's the one that's the little tiny cursor right below the big one over on the left side of the menu there. And basically what happens is I lay down a line with the pencil and then come back in and actually just kind of tune it up. And that's one of the differences that I think a lot of people who come from Photoshop or some other traditional painting or drawing programs kind of have a hard time getting used to, is that if you're doing vector, there's a lot of finicky stuff, because not only do you lay down the line, but then after you lay down the line, you're going to come in and essentially grab every single little piece of it and kind of mold it to make it go in exactly the right spot that you want it to. And there's certainly plenty of erasing and stuff in traditional methods, but it seems like there's quite a bit of it that kind of catches people off guard when it comes to vector. So just be prepared for that. So what I want to do here was essentially do some little concepts, because I didn't want the burden of having to choose which one of these was the best one. So we have these three basic body shapes, and I just deleted that sort of face and mouth that I had on the previous ones. And now I'm laying down these kind of contour lines to just keep in mind the way that I want this form of the slime to feel in 3D space. So this is, again, something new that I haven't done before. And the major goal is just to try to hit a level of depth that's a little bit different than what I've been able to achieve before. So grab this eyeball, pop it on the other side of the head, and then just slam a mouth on here with the pencil. And the goal is just to rapidly have three very different feeling creatures that share the same shape, and then ask Adam or Seth essentially which ones that they like the best, or someone else in the studio, just so I can get some of that initial sort of feedback and see which ones are working, which ones aren't. So it's really quick and dirty. These are just throwing down the shapes of circles, basic circles, turning them into paths. You can do that by hitting Shift-Control-C, and then modifying the nodes. So this one's a bit more of a sort of grub-like creature, little low eyeballs, and maybe just like a weird, octopus mouth sort of situation. And again, you'll notice that every time I draw a line, I end up coming back in with the node tool and kind of poking it around, because it's never quite going to go exactly where you want it to go. And I also very rarely use this pen tool unless I just need to make a very particular closed shape. So I use it for this eyeball here, but then you see I came in and removed every single node except for those three. Kind of throw a few brief details on here just to make sure I have the space figured out. And you see how those guiding lines are actually really helping when it comes to putting down the mouth, that sort of thing. So a lot of times with these character designs, you're just trying to rapidly, get a few different things that have a different feel to them. So that's part of also why those contour lines help a lot, those 4 lines that go across the object, because you can use them to say, okay, I'm going to put the eyes in the top, second bracket of these contour lines, or the bottom one for this one. And so it makes it very easy to sort of compare and contrast. So at this point, I basically turned around and I showed the computer to Seth, and I said, hey, which one of these creatures do you like best? And so we very briefly discussed which ones we thought would be better, and then I dive back into it. And the overall point of this, again, was just to really rapidly, over the course of 3 or 4 minutes, and without much investment, build a few of these different concepts out so that we could get a sort of a sense. So this was the winner, the clear winner, I must say. So now that that's figured out, then the actual hard part begins, which is finishing it. And finishing is is sort of a different thing conceptually than just getting started on these pieces. When you're starting, you really just want to figure out, like I said before, the shape and the contour and kind of how it fits, how it's going to be thought of in 3D space. And I grabbed a few references here for how to think about slime, because it's a slimy texture. I've never done that before. So then I kind of fade out these lines a little bit just so I can keep them in mind, but actually start working on the details of the piece. And there won't be too many because this is a sort of a simple cartoon style. But you see, I kind of come in and just start playing around and trying to get a few of the sort of pieces that I really like to put on creatures. And so I think everybody, depending on your own preference or your own style, you kind of pick things that you really, really like. And for me, having really fat eyebrows, or these sort of fat eyelids that go right on top of the eyebrow, is one of my favorite things to do with these creatures. They always tend to look a little more mean or angry than other people's, but it's become sort of a fun signature thing. And at this point, this is a new thing I've been doing, which is actually separating the color and the line work apart. And so the line work now, what happened just there, that split, was I separated them apart and then laid them back on top of each other. So what this allows me to do then is actually come in with colors and draw the colors on for shading purposes. So if you're familiar with my previous videos, the way that I used to do art and used to do shading was actually just to throw an opacity shadow of like 30% onto whatever the thing was and use a color like dark blue or something like that to get that depth popping in there. The only problem I found with that over time was that it sits on top of your black lines, which means that your black lines end up getting a little, they get miscolored sometimes toward the bottom, especially if you're using red or some other weird shadows. And here again, I'm looking at some of the references that I pulled just from Googling around for goo images and stuff, just to see how this substance even works. Come look at them, come back here. So then when I get to the coloring here, then the primary difference between this method and the old one is that I don't actually use any transparency. And what this allows me to do is actually fully control exactly what the color is going to be kind of as it comes out. And this color scheme I basically lifted off of one of those other pictures that I found that I just really like kind of how they handle it. And that's something I think you should absolutely do if you're doing art, especially in a game jam context. Feel free to find other images that you like and pull colors from them or things that they really did well and learn how they kind of did stuff. So what I noticed about slimes in particular is the weird thing about them is that they have basically a lot of weird shading stuff going on. So they always have this sort of internal either glow or shadow happening. So I just drew my little light source on there just so I can keep that in mind going forward. And I wanted to play with gradients a little bit here too. So I got that internal piece, but it's not quite dark enough. And so you'll see I just kind of grab some colors and start messing around with that initial color concept and then start darkening each thing. And if you notice, the way I'm choosing colors here is actually also very different than in years past. And so what I do now is you actually just, if you want to make a shadow, then you go on this circular wheel and you move it toward the sort of deep blue zone of the wheel, and then pick a slightly darker color. And what this does is it does this thing called hue shifting. And what hue shifting does is makes a really nice color palette almost no matter where you start. So you see this one on the right here is actually built from just slowly rotating the hue around that circle and then picking a slightly darker color. And it ends up making way more rich color palettes, generally speaking. So now I'm trying to blob in some other stuff to make it feel, again, like this is a slime, and there's like a little more depth or body in this particular figure. And nailing substances is very, very difficult in vector because you don't really oftentimes have a lot of gradients going on. Gradients are kind of computationally expensive, so I tend to not use them very much. I am using one as a base here, but the textures and substances are oftentimes very subtle changes in light, sort of thrown across an entire body or an entire image. And so they can be very, very hard to pull off when you're working in vector because everything is very discrete. So each individual piece of this overall artwork you can see, like that shadow, that highlight on top of the lip, all this stuff ends up being its own separate piece. And so there's not much in terms of blending going on, which can be very big struggle when you're trying to figure out how you make grass or how you make something that feels slimy or whatever else. And I've actually found that there's a series of tutorials by Saint 11 on Patreon, and it's actually pixel art, but vector and pixel art share a lot of the same problems, which is that because you can't necessarily you're dealing with really big blocks of color, really big blocks of of substance, then you have to come up with a bunch of these different tricks that end up being basically the same across vector and pixel art. So I would highly recommend, if anyone's doing vector, don't worry about looking at vector tutorials in particular. You can actually look at a lot of pixel art tutorials, which are very common nowadays because of how popular that is, and use some of the same principles. The application's, of course, a little bit different because vector's super weird, but the overall ideas are exactly the same. So you can see I picked another color there and just did all that shadowing to kind of start adding some depth. And I'll do this quite a bit where I go back and forth about, what the heck the color of a particular thing is going to be. But the important thing is just to get it good enough and then, lay in the shadows and kind of start working up the whole piece. And oftentimes when I've completely done something, I'll actually completely change the color scheme too, depending on what it's needed for in the game. And I love these big shinies on the eyes. It's one of my favorite things to do. Just because it tends to make creatures that look very, dopey and cartoony, which is fun. And again, more shadows just to start kind of pulling some dimension out of this creature overall. And you'll notice that the more of them we start adding in here, the sort of we're building up this three-dimensional sense of what the creature is. And you notice that shadow is actually extremely bright purple. And the only reason in this particular case that I chose this one is, again, because of hue shifting. If you just sort of told me to look at that blue and just pick something that was a good shadow for it, before I wouldn't have chosen like an extremely vibrant purple to throw on top of it. But you notice that it actually does work. It goes darker, but it also, in my case, I really like using high contrast or high saturation values in shadows because they make your work feel a lot richer. So it's like a dark purple that actually feels very, very vibrant. When it's in the shadow, can make your work feel very, very colorful, which is nice. And slimes have these multiple layers of shadows and stuff going on. So we have that sort of light blue thing going on, and then I threw this sort of teal on there to start making it feel like it's just kind of wet and reflecting light in kind of those weird globular ways that slime does. And every so often I'll just rip the lines off. Like I said, they are separate now in terms of how I do things, to just see kind of how the whole thing is reading overall. And you'll notice I throw a lot of things on that I end up just completely taking off. So it's very, very fast, and you try to stay pretty loose and just have a lot of fun with throwing these things on. And just recognize at any point you can disappear stuff. You can take stuff away, you can completely delete it, or just hit Control-Z a bunch of times, and it really doesn't matter. That's one of the nice things about vector is you can't, because it's all done in pieces, you can't necessarily permanently mess up a lot of stuff. So here I just noticed that the overall level of contrast at the bottom was not quite high enough for me, so I just drew a really big shadow on it to start with, and then I'll go in and actually carve out of that instead. So this is another way. If you find your pieces tend to just not quite have a lot of depth to them, try drawing a huge shadow on them first, and then actually coming in and using the subtraction tool. You draw shapes on top and then subtract out of that shadow. I find that if you start with a big shadow on something, you're 9 times out of 10 going to make it feel a lot more like it has a lot of depth going on, because you'll tend to have more shadows, which is the thing that makes it feel like there's depth. And I've also been doing this lately, which is sort of removing a little bit of the piece on the very, very side of the creature or of the object, whatever else to do. Essentially, it's just another lighting technique, but it adds a little bit of extra dimension to it too. And we'll add a highlight in there later as well. So now again, with Goos, we want to really play up how moist this thing is. So we're just going to throw a bunch of these little dots on it, and then come in with some highlights on that edge there. And I actually use lines for these sometimes, just because they're, it's just a line. It's just a stroke on the edge of the thing. So we can do that and then put it underneath that line work. And that's it. So that's our goop. That's how our goop turned out for the Shenanigan Jam. And if you want to go play the game, it is again available in the description below. Otherwise, I hope this sort of gave you some insight as to how I make things nowadays, and maybe helps you with choosing colors, or really trying to add some good form and shape to your Inkscape creatures. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time. Bye.